Greetings, this is Professor Lamb. This is, again, something a little different. Some of you remember that, I guess it's been about 6 weeks ago or so, maybe a month, I don't know. I did a discussion with another individual about Dion Fortune. And there was something about that interview that sparked something in me, and I've talked about it in a couple of other videos, but I decided to begin a practice. Hopefully I'll be able to do this a couple times a month. This is a deep impulse that has been arising in me to provide some materials or practices which, like Dion Fortune intended for her own network, might provide inspiration, protection, and perhaps a vision of how to go forward as we enter what seems to be a dark night of conflict. Now, it may seem to us that Dion Fortune benefited from having a well-defined enemy, quote unquote, in the Nazis, thus making her tasks of visualization and unification easier. However, when one reads her letters and essays, it's clear that she didn't always see it that way. After all, the Nazis and the British, the Germans and the British shared many aspects of common culture, up to intermarriages within the royal houses and aristocracy. She understood that the roots of the English and German languages were the same, came from the same place, and that the Germans were in the process of recasting all elements of the German Enlightenment, including some of the greatest philosophers of the Western world, like Kant, for example, and some of the greatest composers of the Western world, like Beethoven and Mozart. They were recasting that in the fascist mold. What made her task difficult, as it is for us, is that the enemy, quote unquote, is not all that different than we are. Indeed, many times people that we regard as our adversaries have been declared the enemy by others, by individuals and groups who have concluded that they are besieged simply because they find that they have been left out of the larger political social equation by those who actually wield power, and by virtue of that will simply not get their way any longer, or they've concluded that anyway. In other words, we, quote unquote, or they, feel, experience, or think that there is an enemy out there, but it's not clear who that enemy might be, and so people are led down all kinds of rabbit holes into trying to figure out who the enemy is. Therefore, the challenge of this task, these meditations in these times, is to be as universal as possible so that anyone, regardless of immediate political outlook or inclination, regardless of religion doctrine or lack thereof, regardless of social station or situation in life, might benefit from them if they actually take these things, these practices and ideas up and work with them. Now, honestly, I'm not sure I'm completely up for this task, but I also know that I don't have to do all of it or even succeed in it all the time. To paraphrase the Talmud, I am not required to complete these tasks, but neither am I free to avoid contributing what I can to them. So I decided to begin with the challenges I face and what I do to confront those challenges, as I don't believe that I'm that different, after all is said and done, from most people. I'll stick with what seems to bother most people, with the most common impulses, desires, and urges. Share a story, a practice that has helped me. Keep it deeply and profoundly simple. So what I'm going to do in this first entry is I'm going to tell a story. This story has gained some currency in some places on the web. You can see here what I've got up. It comes from the teachings of a man who lived in the late 19th and early 20th century in Mali, while the French were still the colonial power there. His name was Cherno Bokar, and his life and teachings have come down to us through two main sources: a biography written by one of his students, Amadou Hampâté Bey, and a dissertation translated from the French. And so these are some of the few photographs, actually, that survive of Cherno Bokar, except for this color picture here on the far bottom left. It's an actor who is playing the role of Cherno Bokar in a dramatization of his life. The book that is published about him by Amadou Hampâté Bey, A Spirit of Tolerance, can be seen here. It is still in print, and it is a very good book, especially as an introduction to the Mali form of Tijaniya, which is one of the branches of Sufism in northern and western Africa. So the story in this case was told by this Sufi master. He lived during a time of tumult in Malian culture. There were conflicts between Muslim and non-Muslim tribes, conflicts between Sufis, or what really constituted the mainstream of Muslims, and more radical proto-fundamentalist Muslims who sought to drive out the French, and even conflicts between varying schools of the Tijaniya order, of which Bokar was for a time a respected initiate and teacher. Now, these conflicts caught up with him eventually, and he paid an ultimate price for sticking with his principles of tolerance and openness to others. His stories remain, and I, for one, have benefited immensely from his teachings and approach to life. So, for this first installment, I will tell his story of the blackbirds and the whitebirds. Although this seems to be just a story, it is in fact an illustration of a contemplative practice, which will become clear as the story proceeds. As with all Sufi stories, the principles outlined are deceptively simple. The actual practice implied is often quite difficult and penetrating, but if pursued, is completely transformative. It's really a matter of whether you indeed want to be transformed. So this is taken directly from this book, A Spirit of Tolerance. And to provide a little context, this is a story that was given during one of his teachings with students. And it was the author of this story, or the recorder of this story, Amadou Hampâté Bey, who actually witnessed the telling of this story. He said not only did he refrain from judging others, he's speaking of Cherno Bokar, but he went further. He tried to make us understand that a good thought is always preferable to a bad one, even when it is about those whom we consider our enemies. It was not always easy to convince us, as shown by the following anecdote in which he spoke to us of white birds and blackbirds. He was commenting on the Quranic verse, which is Surah 99, verses 7 through 8. And whoso does an atom's weight of good will see it then, and whoso does an atom's weight of ill will see it then. So they were questioning him on the subject of good acts. And he said the good act is the most beneficial is that which consists of praying for one's enemies. And the class reacted with great surprise. You know, generally people tend to curse their enemies rather than bless them. That seems kind of stupid to bless them. And he said, perhaps, but only in the eyes of those who do not understand. Men certainly have the right to call down curses upon their enemies, but they wrong themselves more by speaking ill of them than by blessing them. And, of course, his audience, his students didn't understand. Surely if the enemy is destroyed, wouldn't that make us satisfied? And Chernow responded, in appearance, perhaps, but this is then only a satisfaction of the egotistical soul, or the nafs, therefore a satisfaction at a lower material level. From a mystical point of view, the fact of blessing one's enemy is more beneficial, even if one is thought to be a fool in the eyes of ignorant people. In reality, one's spiritual maturity and the degree of one's wisdom becomes apparent by this. And he illustrates this by telling the story of the white birds and the black birds. So this is quoting Chernow. In relation to one another, men are like walls that face each other. Each wall has in it a multitude of small holes where white birds and black birds are nested. The black birds are bad thoughts and bad words. The white birds are good thoughts and good words. Because of their shape, the white birds can only enter into holes for white birds, and the same holds true for the black birds, who can only nest in holes for blackbirds. Now imagine two men who believe they are enemies of each other. Let's call them Yosef and Ali. One day Yosef, persuaded that Ali wishes him ill, feels full of anger towards Ali and sends him a very bad thought. In doing this, Yosef releases a black bird and at the same time frees up a corresponding hole. His blackbird flies towards Ali and looks for an empty hole to nest in that is adapted to its shape. If from his side Ali has not sent a black bird towards Yosef, that is, if Ali has not sent out any bad thoughts, none of his black holes will be empty. Finding no place to lodge itself, Yosef's black bird will be obliged to return to its original nest, taking with it the evil with which it was burdened, an evil which will end up eroding and destroying Yosef himself. But let us imagine that Ali has sent out a bad thought too. In doing this, he frees up a hole in which Yosef's black bird will be able to enter and then deposit part of his evil, thus accomplishing his mission of destruction. During all this, Ali's black bird will fly toward Yosef and will lodge itself in the hole freed up by Yosef's black bird. Thus, the two black birds will have achieved their goal and will have been effective in destroying the men for whom each was destined. But once their task is accomplished, each black bird will return to its nest of origin because, as it is said, everything returns to its source. Since the evil they were loaded with has not been exhausted, this evil will turn against their originators and will end up destroying them. The person who creates a bad thought or a bad wish or an ill-spoken word is therefore attacked by both the blackbird of his enemy and by his own blackbird when this latter returns to him. The same thing happens with white birds. If we send out only good thoughts toward our enemy, while the enemy only addresses bad thoughts to us, the enemy's blackbirds will not find any place to lodge themselves with us and will return to their sender. As for the white birds who bear good thoughts that we have sent to him, if they find no free place with our enemy, they will return to us charged with all the beneficial energy which they are carrying. Thus, if we send out only good thoughts, no evil and no curses can ever reach into our being. This is why one should always ask for blessings on both one's friends and one's enemies. Not only does the benediction go towards its objective in order to accomplish its mission of making peace, but it also comes back to us, sooner or later, with all that it is carrying. This is what Sufis call desirable egoism. It is the commendable love of self, which is tied to respect for oneself and for one's neighbor. This is because every man, good or bad, is the depository of a part of the divine light. That is why Sufis, in accordance with the teaching of the Prophet, do not want to soil either their mouths or their beings with bad words or bad thoughts, or even with seemingly benign criticisms. And that's the end of the story. Because of the principle that everything returns to its source, he urged us to produce only the purest spiritual vibrations by consecrating our thought and tongue to the recitation of the name of God, what is called zikr. Now, this is not some kind of Pollyanna sort of operation. You'll notice that Chernow doesn't contradict his student. He understands how natural it is for us to hate and fear those whom we call enemies, or who have determined that we are their enemies. He doesn't say anything about confronting our adversaries, arguing with them, trying to convince them. He also doesn't say that we shouldn't protect ourselves physically if we need to. What he does is tie the practice of beneficial thoughts to our love for ourselves, our better selves. In other words, beneficence emerges from our knowledge of ourselves, our regard for ourselves, which we then extend to others, regardless of what those others might do, regardless of how they might seem to us or how we might seem to them. Now, this is actually a very difficult charge for many people, and I encourage you to try to do this with individuals with whom you actively disagree or feel threatened by. So this is a practice of contemplation. You are not trying to change them, convince them, or even protect yourself from them, although clearly if you're physically threatened, you need to take responsible action to protect yourself in that way. All you are doing, at least initially, is ceasing to send out negative thoughts, blackbirds out about them, toward them. Nothing else is required, no arguments, no discourse, no narrative. So pay less attention to what you think they are doing or thinking, since most of the time you really don't know if you are honest with yourself and you get off of social media. I mean, that's part of the problem with social media, is that all of these various commentators make a lot of assumptions on either side about what people are doing and why they are doing it. Rather pay attention to your thoughts, what you are doing. You really can't change what others are doing anyway. Black birds sent out will return and make the world more black and seem blacker and blacker and blacker and more hopeless. And of course, I need to apologize to all actual birds who are black in the world. Obviously, we're not talking about crows and doves here, all right? Now, when I apply the principles of this contemplation, I try to watch my breathing, because I've noticed that when I have less inclination to float my white birds, even just up in the air, my breathing has often already changed and is faster and more shallow. Namely, I am not relaxed. I'm agitated. There's some sense of being defensive, some sense of wanting to be right, afraid that I'll be powerless in the face of those who might threaten me. So when you attempt this contemplation, just pay attention to how your body is responding. Pay attention to how you're breathing. Try to breathe more deeply. Try to slow down. Try to find the white birds, the thoughts that would make most sense. Now, I use this story a lot because I have lots of opinions and fears and negative thoughts. I have not mastered this practice and am not a very virtuous person in many ways. The story of this practice is a constant struggle for me because of who I am, because of my thoughts and fears, and my background. My point is not to become perfect at this, but to become aware of how each of us contributes to the greater conflicts of which we are now all a part. There are people who have become addicted to the blackbird cycle, or worse, can't tell the difference between their own black and white birds, their own thoughts. This story is about what each individual one of us personally does, not really about the other person. Is it envy, actual injustice, simple fear of difference, something else? Now, in my own contemplations using this story, I also wonder about the possibility of gray birds, an acknowledgement that sending beneficial thoughts to or for your other or your enemy or your adversary might be difficult or even impossible in some circumstances, but you might be able to keep from sending out black thoughts, even if you do this for your own purposes. In other words, not because you want to help them, but understand that sending out black thoughts is ultimately a form of self-harm. For example, instead of sending white birds or good thoughts to the enemy, send white birds upward with the petition that the light may descend upon all of us, enemies and friends alike. It's not like we don't all need some. And don't neglect the power of humor in this process of self-reflection. Because, as you'll see, Cherno-Bokar did not neglect the power of humor in many of his stories. So see if any of this helps you.